The what if season is wide open. What if this or that happens this fall? What sends the maximum amount of reverberation through the sport? Well, the first one we're going to talk about tonight would have college football wide impact. Ewan said, what if Texas A&M has another down season? I'm going to take that to mean 7-6 wins, something like that. Well, the first thing we have to obviously ask is, if that were to be the case, what happens to Jimbo Fisher? Currently, his buyout would be $77 million after 2023. It would be $68 million after 2024. Those are just huge numbers. Most of us don't traffic in. I mean, those are management type numbers. We don't traffic. You and I don't traffic in those kind of numbers. We can barely count that high. And so there are differing schools of thought out there. There's one school of thought that Texas A&M football is so important that there is no buyout high enough. If you're underachieving, if they think the only thing separating them from championship contention is the head coach, they'll buy him out at any cost. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is no one in their right mind is paying a guy $77 million not to coach the football team. You decide which school you belong to. But in the meantime, if this doesn't happen, well, obviously that also means the whole Bobby Petrino hire probably didn't work out. They didn't do any better than they did last year in one-score games. They had, I think, 5 losses, was it, last year by 6 points or less? So that probably repeated itself. This is not an easy road slate, by the way, for the Aggies. This is exhibit number 1 million, why I could not care less how many conference games you play as the end-all, be-all metric, because I'm looking at their schedule. They play, this is the road stretch for them. They go to Miami, to Tennessee, to LSU, to Ole Miss. They also play Arkansas in Dallas, and that is not to mention the fact that they play Auburn and Alabama at home, and they get South Carolina in there too. So that's a lot of close football games, to say the least. And if this happens, the reason I say it reverberates college football wide is because I believe this is a keystone job, and the keystone job is one where they can afford to put themselves in the market for anyone. There is no amount of money they would not spend on a salary pool for the right group of head coaches. It would be almost a ready-made roster to win with immediately. Administration is great. The fan base is unmatched in terms of passion. So it would be a turnkey at one of the highest levels of the sport if it were to ever come open. But here's the other side of that. What if this isn't true? And what if it does work out? And that's not what was asked, but I'm asking it. You know, what if A&M totally turns it around this year? You see why that's one of those inflection point teams? Think about how different that looks. Think about how different it sounds asking about whether Jimbo Fisher's going to be fired the first week of December versus is Texas A&M going to extend Bobby Petrino multiple years and double his salary because this just works so well? Is A&M going to win the SEC championship game? Could literally go either way with a roster as good as theirs. Next up, Nola said, what if Penn State wins the Big Ten? This is a game changer for James Franklin. This is his arrival to the Tier 1 college football table. I think that's what it would sound like, because I think if Penn State wins the Big Ten, I think they're in the college football playoff. Not the 12-team version, the 4-team version. The version many of you think they're incapable of breaking through and entering. They have got the third best odds to win the Big Ten right now. They go to Ohio State. Just to give you an idea of what the odds market thinks about that, they play at Ohio State in Week 8. They are a 10.5-point dog. They play against Michigan at home 3 weeks later, and Michigan is favored by about 2.5 at Penn State. So they are a dog, not huge, but they are a dog in both of their biggest games. If they do pull this off, though, and they absolutely have the capability. Forget about quarterback for a second. If Drew Aller plays at a high level, that's like a whole nother stratosphere of a conversation. But they have a great tandem in the backfield. They probably have the best left tackle in football. They have a phenomenal defense led by a phenomenal defensive coordinator in Manny Diaz. Not a lot of holes on that team. So this is not something that would be shocking, but there's a group of people that would be shocked by it, because there's a group of people that just think the ceiling for that team, the ceiling for a James Franklin program is below that. I don't happen to be that, but this would be, I think, the biggest step they've taken as a program in a long, long time. That would be playoff access. That would be really big. It would be not just for this year. Think about what that does for recruiting. Think about the hype machine behind Penn State going into 2024. So if Aller takes them to the playoff, a Big Ten championship and a probable playoff trip as a true freshman, you're talking about preseason national championship consideration for Penn State the following year. You would have them in conversations they've never been in under James Franklin up there, or in most of our lifetimes, actually. Next up, now this one's wild. This one's wild, but it does need to be talked about because it just happened. So Ian said, what if TCU makes the playoff again? This was like a Phil Collins special. This was against all odds last year. Close games every week. Somehow, ladies and gentlemen, TCU did not win the Big 12 and went to the playoff. I have said before, and I'll say again, that will be the most misremembered thing about the 2022 season is that TCU won the Big 12. That's how everyone remembers it. They did not. Kansas State did. It's just that TCU's resume was good enough that they didn't need to win their conference title game. Now, that is something you think only happens in the SEC normally or the Big Ten. Nope, happened in the Big 12 last year. This would stun me pretty significantly if they were to make it again. Their 2023 S&P Plus ranking is 20th. That's third highest in the Big 12 entering the season, but they're 98th in returning production. Very controversial stat, returning production. They lost their OC, Garrett Riley, to Clemson. They lost their quarterback, top 2 rushers, top 3 wide receivers, some key offensive linemen. They're only one of 3 teams in that conference that have to play OU and Texas. So with all that, what if they still make the playoff? That would cement them as a current top 10 program in college football. That's what it would do. I mean, if anybody pulled that off, if Kirby Smart pulled that off with all those kind of losses, it's a big deal. If Sonny Dykes pulls it off, and therefore his first 2 seasons in Fort Worth equaled 2 playoff appearances, you're talking about sort of rewriting top 10, both in terms of head coaches, in terms of programs. So that'd be a really big deal. And the Big 12 would have representation again. I would also love to know, by the way, if they make it, did they make it at the expense of Texas and OU? Because that's its own little story that needs to be told. Lastly, now this one's the most intriguing probably of the 4. What if an ACC team not named Florida State or Clemson makes that college football playoff? Whomst would this be? We looked at the odds past the top 2. Those are clearly the top 2. You look at the odds past the top 2 in the ACC. You got North Carolina and Louisville tied for 3rd. Miami's 5th. NC State is 6. Pitt is 7. And it pretty much drops off a cliff after that to Duke, for the record. I have a sneaking suspicion that Louisville is just going to figure out a way to hang around this because Louisville has by far the most fortuitous schedule in the ACC. But that would be the talk. If Louisville were to make the playoff, it will be for the fact that they navigated a far less than treacherous schedule. They don't play FSU in the regular season. They don't play Clemson in the regular season. And then they figured out a way to win they either figured out a way to win the ACC championship game or, just follow me here, what if Louisville were to be this year's TCU? They win a bunch of close games. They'll just be favored in a lot of these games, period. They go into Charlotte, I think that's where the game is, undefeated, don't even win the ACC championship game, but the rest of the country shakes out in such a way that 2 teams from the ACC can make it. What if that were to happen? That's a big what if. But if it weren't Louisville, if Miami does this, you need to listen to me very closely. I tell you all the time, you're not ready for Texas to be back, or you're not ready for Alabama fans if Alabama really, truly falls off. I'm not totally sure. In fact, I'm very sure the rest of the country is not ready for Miami to be back. You're not ready for 56-year-old sports writers to start using the word swagger. You're not ready for folks throwing that U up in your face, in the middle of a grocery store. You're not ready for all of those T-shirts with the stickers still on them all over the country. Miami's a really unique place. Miami is a place probably more so than any major school in the country where that big a percentage of the fan base did not go there. So it's a pretty small school. It's a private school. So a vast majority of the alumni are not actually alumni. They just identify with Miami. And nothing wrong with that. I got no problem with that. But it makes for a different dynamic when you're not winning. When you're not winning, those folks don't have the same kind of attachment that you, a Mississippi State fan, have because you graduated from there and you've lived within 20 miles of Starkville your whole life. That's a different kind of attachment. A lot of these folks live in LA, they live in Atlanta, they live in Raleigh, they live in New York, and a lot of them live in Miami. But if you're not winning, they're not giving you that time like they would if they were in Auburn. But here's where some of you are wrong. Some of you think, oh, Miami game day atmosphere leaves a lot to be desired. It does when they're losing. I will promise you, and I know I'm right because I've seen it happen, I will promise you, if Miami gets things figured out, if they're back on top of the ACC, if Miami is ever a college football playoff contender, they will sell out Hard Rock. Make no mistake about it, because it almost happened a few years ago. There's just a game that's kind of been forgotten by the public. It was in the latter portion of the Mark Richt era. They played Notre Dame down there. Smoked them, by the way. And Hard Rock Stadium was unlike anything you've seen down there outside of a playoff game or a national title game. It was jammed to the rafters. You couldn't hear anything. Everybody was stunned. I was talking to someone who was with the broadcast crew a few weeks ago, and they were talking about that game. They were saying, people think Miami can't pack a stadium. No, they're not going to pack a stadium or come close to it if the team's not good. If the team's good, it is the most radical difference. It's the most radical turnaround in the nature of a fan base that you'll see anywhere. USC is kind of like that. Miami is absolutely like that.